quick way of introducing, I'll be short, if that's okay with you.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to quickly say that Susan Neiman was born in the United States, actually in Georgia. She then had a quite itinerant life that brought her to many places, amongst them Tel Aviv, but also then, as of late, um, Berlin, on and off. Actually, you had two different periods in Berlin, one during the 1980s that I also still remember, which is kind of a bizarre moment to remember because that world doesn't exist any longer. And
Yeah.
then the Berlin of today. And in between, you trained and became a philosopher. You taught in Tel Aviv, at Yale University, at Princeton, and many other places. And you've really made yourself a name as a philosopher. But in this book, you're turning on a little bit of a personal narrative and more of a historical introspection that engages a real interesting question that normally, how shall I say it, is often a little bit on the politicized spectrum, and that is, how do we make these comparisons, or how do we learn from the past by making comparisons or not, or engaging different histories into each other. And at the time when your book came out, not long thereafter, there came another book that came out, the book by Isabel Wilkerson, that was addressing and was relying already on you and on a comparison about actually the forms of racism, whereas your interest is different. You're more interested in the cultures of remembrance or the absence of it and how respectively they're operated. Just as a way of introducing myself, my biography is a little bit reverse to yours. I'm originally from Hamburg, and now I'm in the United States, and I'm directing the Ackerman Center, and I've been fortunate to host these events, a couple of interrelated lectures on the humanities and the crisis of the humanities. And to me, that always was a conversation, not just simply about what we are in the humanities, but also the ways by which we deal with the crisis and violence of our past. And so that's in lots of ways the bridge over which I said, great opportunity to invite a speaker that I really wanted to have an opportunity to talk to. So that's a little bit the kind of wider context of our conversation here. So if it's okay with you, then I think let's maybe jump in a little bit into this conversation. I think for starters, when one makes this comparison about how Germans respectively dealt with the legacies of the Third Reich and the remembrance, and then respectively how the US has or has not dealt with the remembrance of slavery, one is very quickly drawn into with the kind of one's own positions respectively in this comparison. And I think you're very upfront about this, and it's kind of one of the many appealing factors of your book, that you as a person, as a voice, don't hide behind the narrative, but one is always very keenly aware of where you respectively are and from what kind of perspective do you speak. Can you talk a little bit about your so to speak, your positions respectively as a describer and participant, insofar as you were born in the United States and live in Germany, so you're not just a kind of distant observer to either one of the sides of the comparison.
Sure, and I'm glad you mentioned the crisis in the humanities, because I think part of the crisis in humanities is, self-caused. I think so many people in the humanities, first of all, don't make the effort to write for more than their graduate students and a few of their colleagues. And it's very important for me to write in the spirit of the Enlightenment for a general public. Even Immanuel Kant, not the greatest writer who ever lived, wrote 15 essays for the Berlinische Monatsschrift, which I compare to a sort of 18th century New York review. So even Immanuel Kant was able to do this and cared about doing this. And I think one of the problems with all branches of the humanities is they often don't even talk to each other, much less to anybody who's outside of academia. And it's always been very important for me to do so. In fact, that's how I got into the Enlightenment and indeed into Kant, because they were doing things that 20th and now 21st century writers tend not to do. Probably the most important fact about my life is something that I only realized, we all realize a lot of things about what influenced us as we get older, was the fact that I grew up in the middle of the civil rights movement. I was born in Atlanta, but my parents were Yankee Jews. And so it was very clear that we didn't really belong to Atlanta. Atlanta, when I was growing up there, I was born in 55, was not the Atlanta of today, of course. It was a much smaller, much more provincial place without the influx of outsiders that you now have. So being an outsider was part of my life, but perhaps even more importantly, my mother got involved in the campaign to desegregate the Atlanta public schools. And it was an involvement that brought us threats from the Klan, but it's something that I'm quite proud of looking back on it. And it meant that was really the framework of my life. My parents weren't intellectuals, but my mother's belief that actually being Jewish, she wouldn't have described it this way, but it's a universalist tradition within Judaism. There are two traditions in Judaism. One is more tribalist and one is more universalist. Being a universalist Jew meant caring about everyone else who had ever been persecuted. So that if we, as we're told to remember every Pesach, if we were slaves in the land of Egypt, we should stand with the people who were slaves in the land of Georgia. And that was a huge influence on me in ways, of course, that only became clear to me much, much later. So I studied philosophy, thinking, again, that was a way to talk about, you say this work is more explicitly political than some of my earlier works, but I do see most of my work as having a political thrust. I trained with the great political philosopher John Rawls at Harvard. And although Rawls was very abstract, wrote in the abstract, that was a kind of, I won't say it was an influence as much as it continued this universalist concern with justice. I applied for a Fulbright fellowship while I was doing my graduate work, thinking I would go to Berlin, learn some German, learn a little bit about contemporary German philosophy, and come back and get on the academic track. And I was derailed by what Germans call Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, which I translate as working off the past. And when I came to Berlin in 1982, this was not a government project, at least not in West Germany. It was a government project in the East in certain ways. But this was a grassroots project. It was shortly before the 50th anniversary of the Nazis' takeover of power. And I was absolutely fascinated by the fact that the sort of people that I would normally gravitate towards, this was not the general population, but intellectuals, artists, political activists, were preparing to commemorate the 50th anniversary in all kinds of ways. They were vying with each other to produce histories of their neighborhoods. They were making films about the Third Reich. They were producing art exhibits. It was inescapable, at least in West Berlin. I gather it was quite different in Hamburg or in other parts of West Germany. And I was absolutely fascinated already, simply when I arrived. And I asked myself at the time, why have Americans stopped talking about the Vietnam War since it's been over? And I should say, having cut my teeth almost literally on the civil rights movement, it was fairly natural that as a teenager, I should be involved in the campaigns to protest the war in Vietnam. And I remembered and noted we never had a national discussion about Hiroshima. There was an attempt to do one 50 years after Hiroshima. And the exhibit that had been planned in the Smithsonian was actually stopped by Newt Gingrich's Congress. If anybody's interested in that, I wrote an essay about that. It's on my website. So anyway, I was fascinated with that. Berlin seemed a more intellectually exciting place than Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time. I'm grateful for the things that I learned at Harvard. I had wonderful teachers and wonderful colleagues, but it's very much an ivory tower. And Berlin very much was not. It was in the middle of history. And of course, at the time, the wall was there. It gave me the opportunity with an American passport to go to East Berlin, certainly as often as I wanted, to meet people there and to have a rather different take on East Germany than many people do. That part of the book has been quite controversial, particularly in Germany, not only in Germany, but not, I've convinced some people, put it this way. Easterners love that part of the book. Westerners, not so much, but I have convinced some of them. I lived in West Berlin for about 6.5 years and decided to leave for a number of reasons, but really mostly because I did not feel that a Jew, and by that time I had one child already, a Jew could live a normal life in Germany. It was simply too awkward. I'm not even sure that another kind of foreigner, unless perhaps they were Turkish and chose to live in the somewhat ghettoized situation that Turkish people were living at the time. But there was just a deep uncomfortability with Jews. And I decided to leave on the idea that I could have a more normal life teaching philosophy at Yale, which I did for some time. I wasn't happy with the Ivy League portion of Yale, and I went to teach Tel Aviv for 5 years, which is where the Einstein Forum found me. The Einstein Forum is it's an interdisciplinary international public think tank, and it allowed me to have a foot in academia and a foot in the rest of the world, and that made it my dream job. And it was 2 years after the red-green government, the Social Democratic Green government, had taken over, really very important political change in Germany, and very much a different attitude towards Germanness, towards foreigners, towards Jews. And I decided that it was possible and desirable and pleasant to move back to Berlin, where I have now been for the last 21 years. But I was always looking at the question, how far have the Germans come in dealing with their past? Yes, they may have come further than the United States, but have they come far enough? I didn't decide to write this book, however, until June 2015, which I date as the beginning of the American Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. It's really quite striking to think how far we have come in not quite 6 years. June 2015 was when President Obama gave the eulogy for the 9 churchgoers massacred in Charleston. And it was the first time that a national political figure had made the connection between the present day violence and our repression and ignorance of the violence of our past. And I must say that even though I had grown up in the middle of the civil rights movement, there were many, many things of which I was not aware in the least until 2015. And then a lot of things came into play. So I thought, gosh, this is beginning. This is important. And having thought about Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung in Germany for the 30 previous years, I thought, well, this is something to which I can make a contribution. I did not want to lecture at the US from afar. I had a sabbatical coming to me, and I spent the better part of a year based in Oxford, Mississippi, as a guest scholar at the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation, which I used as a base to interview people in the Deep South who were working on different understandings of American history and working on racial reconciliation. So the book has my perspective. I wanted to make that crystal clear, that this is not a it's not an academic book, but it's also not attempting to abstract from my own position. But I also didn't want to have it only be my voice or only my own position. So I interviewed a large number of people through the Deep South, some of them famous, like Brian Stevenson or James Meredith, some of them not so famous, some of them who I didn't agree with at all. And again, the same principle in Germany, interviewing many people who were part of the process of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung and people who were affected by it. And somehow I had 3 times as much material as I could possibly use, but it all came together. And what I think is interesting, really, if you look at it, when I began this project, and I really began it seriously in 2016, Germans laughed at me, and Americans found it shocking that I should in any sense compare German history and American history. In fact, there was an NEH fellowship that I was supposed to be a shoo-in to get, and one of the jurors blocked it by saying it was tendentious to make any such comparison. No one would find this tendentious today, and that's not quite 5 years later. We can talk about, if people are interested, the processes that the US has gone through in the past 4 years that have made people, Americans, extremely interested in hearing how the Germans dealt with the crimes of their past. The German reception of the book has been quite interesting because it sort of belongs to the being a decent German seems to involve today insisting that the Nazi crimes were singular and can't be compared with anything else. And so I've had a lot of pushback when the German edition came out by people who, some people absolutely refused to read a book with the title Learning from the Germans because they said, you know, you can't possibly learn anything from us, and we did too little too late. And I tend to point out that I know perfectly well that the process of coming to terms with the Nazi period was slow and unwilling, and it certainly isn't completed. But it is the case that that very attitude, no, if you could imagine Americans saying, no, we're terrible. You can sort of in one voice, you can't learn anything from us. We can't be a model of anything. You can already see the differences between the US and Germany. Germany has taken some first steps, which America is certainly taking now in the past couple of years. And if it makes Americans feel any better, we are way ahead of Brits, not to mention Spaniards, Austrians, Belgians. I mean, they are just beginning to acknowledge that they have pieces of their history that need to be examined, that need to be worked through if they're going to be a healthy, strong, honest country. Maybe I'll stop there, Niels, and you
Yeah,
can.
sure, of course. No, thank you. Let me just right away jump into just a couple of other quick questions. Just to clarify this, I mean, you're less invested in making comparisons in terms of what's similar or not, but rather you're engaging the questions of the similarities or lack thereof in the aftermath. So in that respect, you're leaving the real hot potato really, maybe, rightly on the side. Whereas Wilkerson is trying to get there in her own ways, but in lots of ways, your comparison is a really interesting one in terms of the culture of remembrance. And I really like that, that you framed this in my mind in two really interesting ways. One of them is by chronology, that you say, well, the Germans also started in many ways far earlier thinking about the past. The US, in many ways, really only started being able to think about it from the like mid 60s onwards. So the chronologies are a little different. And then the other one is, maybe you can speak a little bit more about that as well, that you go back to cultures of defeat and the Shiva and you're emphasizing that in lots of ways, we really misunderstand this deep-seated culture that has come out of the experience of defeat in one way in the United States with the Civil War, and then another way in Germany with the First World War. And I think that's really struck me as a really, really interesting thought, that lots of ways when we think about war and conflict, we always roll it very quickly over and then it's over in aftermath, and we kind of miss really, the kind of very deep-brained trauma that it left in its aftermath. And I think that's a really interesting thought, and the way you make it relevant to the discussion of memory. So maybe if you don't mind spelling that out a little bit more for us.
Sure. Let me say a couple of things. I didn't leave aside the comparison of Nazi crimes and the comparison of American crimes because it was a hot potato.
No. I did not mean to imply that. No.
Yeah, and I do spend the first chapter talking about all the differences between those two cases. I know that there are differences. And I've come to argue, look, the differences are historically interesting, they're anthropologically interesting, they're sociologically interesting, but I don't think they're morally interesting. Anytime a person is persecuted or murdered because they're the member of a particular group, it's racism. And there's different forms of racism towards Jews as there are towards Black people, as there are towards indigenous people. But I think, and this is something I already talked about in my book that I wrote 20 years ago, Evil in Modern Thought, I don't think there's a way to quantify and compare evils in that sense. And I think it's a political task, which I'm not interested in doing. Okay. So, but what I did think would be helpful would be to talk about, again, the differences in the ways that nations and cultures have coped with the evils in their past. One point of correction, I don't think the United States, unless I misheard you, the United States did not begin to deal with its past in the 60s. I really don't think it began seriously until 2015. There were historians who, obviously Eric Foner wrote about Reconstruction, and there are a number of people who did important historical work, but it was not part of public memory at all. And in fact, as late as Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, she was still using language that came straight out of lost cause versions of history. We simply, I've tried to understand why I didn't pick any of this up as a child growing up in the Deep South, why, for instance, I never knew when all those Confederate statues went up. I assumed, as most people did, well, okay, someone wanted to memorialize their fallen son or husband or brother right after the Civil War. And of course, that's not true. But I now think anybody reading a decent newspaper or magazine in the last few years will have found out when those statues went up, and that it was a political act of white supremacy at points in which it looked as if African Americans might achieve civil rights, and people who were hanging on to Confederate ideology wanted to push them back. And I've asked myself, why did I not know that? And I think the real answer is, in the 60s, white people, and far more Black people, of course, were still being killed, for demanding the right to vote. And white and Black children, as I tell in the beginning of my book, couldn't swim in the same lakes. So there was so much to deal with in the present that people just didn't have the luxury of looking through the past. We absolutely didn't. So that's one thing. And your second question turns around the culture of defeat. I really do need to meet Shiva Bush someday, because I liked his book very, very much. And I wondered, however, why he only talked about he made the comparison between, for people who don't know the book, the way Confederate soldiers or people, excellent book.
That's the one.
Between the way that the Confederacy felt defeated and remembered the war and mythologized the war, and the way that Germans did to World War I. And I kept asking myself, why didn't he talk about World War II? And my guess is simply, as a German of that generation, I believe he was born during the war, it would just simply be a taboo to make, it would break the taboo of the singularity of Nazi crimes to compare it to anything else. We're actually having quite a public argument in the media. Germans love long public debates that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment. And we're having a debate again about the singularity of Nazi crimes. But it's at various times it's been an article of faith. So I'm assuming that that's why Shiva Bush only talked about the post World War I. But what struck me was how very, very similar the tropes that people used in the first couple of decades in West Germany after the war, so 40s, 50s, and 60s, how very similar they were to the language that's used by defenders of the lost cause. And that is something that shocks Americans, or indeed anybody who isn't a German. I've seen people's mouths drop open when I say that Germans thought of themselves as the worst victims of the war, but they did. And the argument was like this: we lost the war, our cities are in ashes, we lost 7 million of our citizens, a big chunk of our territory. We were hungry and cold and just barely alive, if anybody gets that reference. And on top of that, the damn Yankees are trying to tell us that the war was our fault. Now, they didn't say damn Yankees, of course, they said the Amis, the Americans, but it was very much the same kind of victim-based lament. And it's not something that people talked about. It's very interesting. When I first came to Berlin in 1982, people were very willing to tell me that their parents had been Nazis or their teachers had been Nazis, and that they had quite destroyed family relations, often because of that fact. But no one ever actually told me my parents were Nazis and they thought they were the worst victims of the war. You have to ferret it out. You have to read things that were written in the first couple of decades after the war. And then, of course, when I asked people about it, they said, well, of course, it was just obvious. Nobody bothered to say it. That is how they felt. And I began to think that given how similar this is to the lost cause attitudes, that it's actually a very normal kind of an attitude. That is, we all start by wanting to see our people as heroes. If we can't see our people as heroes for some reason or another, we say, well, history made them victims. They would have been heroes, but history turned them into victims. But the Germans were the first nation to move again from the hero to the victim attitude, to say, well, yes, we suffered, but other people suffered more and their suffering was our fault. And no other country has done that. And I would again say in West Germany, East Germany was a very different story. In many ways, they were ahead of this. There was a very famous speech made by Richard von Weizsäcker as president in 1985 on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the end of the war, in which he basically said just that. You know, we suffered a lot, but other people suffered more. And the interesting thing is I was already in Berlin at the time and my German was good enough to understand the speech. And I couldn't understand what everybody was so excited about. I felt like he was simply stating the obvious, and I didn't know why he had to go on so long about how much the Germans had suffered. But of course, I didn't understand how much the victim attitude was so deep that saying that and calling May 8th, the end of the war, a day of liberation, was in the context of West Germany quite radical. Now, von Weizsäcker certainly didn't do it alone, and people have often asked me, how did the change happen? I think there's a hopeful message in that there isn't one thing that happened. There were a lot of little things that happened. There were a lot of grassroots efforts, starting with church groups in the late 50s and going into intellectuals, artists who were concerned that the crimes of the Nazis not be forgotten. You're going to have to forgive me for 1 minute. That is a package, and if I don't answer the door, they will take it across town. I'm very sorry.
There you go. We wouldn't want you to lose your package. It just gives us a moment to stretch, right? And then we will be even stronger coming back again. Now, of course, we all want to know what's in the package. Maybe she'll tell us or not. Let's give her a brief moment. And then if you want to just slowly ready yourself, I think we'll open it up then to anybody else who wants to ask questions. Like I said, you can just type them out in the chat function. I'll try to pick them up from there, or eventually you can also otherwise unmute yourself and I will try to find you in the pile. You're on several different screens because there are lots of you. So we'll try our best to find you when you want to ask questions, okay? But remember that we don't see you all at once. Meantime, I should say, while she's not there, the book is really worth it. If you haven't read it, hopefully today will make you want to read the book. There's a lot of really interesting things in there. Also in the ways in which she just rethinks really, for example, these other moments of defeat, which I thought was really, really interesting. And how really this kind of what she calls the lost cause becomes really something to which then groups are so tight that they're in lots of ways have nowhere to be and nowhere to else to go. And I think we've watched this also in our own society here right now. I almost promised them that you would share now with us what's in the package, but I just did this for the sake of entertaining everyone for a moment.
It's a lamp, and it's so heavy that I did not want them to take it to the post office, which is way out to hell and gone. So very sorry, this is the home office problem. I haven't been to my real office since October, so
no, not a problem at all.
We're in lockdown here.
Let me just jump in maybe with one more question, and then we want to open it up, because I was just talking a little bit more about this while you were retrieving your package, the idea of the lost cause. But I think there's an early point in the book where I think you cite, what's his name, Neil McGregor, about how we make use of the past or not. And I think that kind of brings it nicely together. On the one side, you have that the groups that are wedded to what you call the lost cause. Then there's a kind of what's described as a British way of looking back at the past as a way of consoling ourselves and being an awe of the greatness of our forebearers. And we recognize that maybe also as something that people do about the American past. But then there's the other element, which I think is really interesting, and that is, whether it is always the case, as stated or not, doesn't really matter. But the Germans tend to look at the past for the benefit of the future. In other words, they don't look back, right, so much as a way of, simply, being inspired by the greatness. I mean, we do that too, but we do that more when we want to look at Goethe and Schiller and Kant and those types of guys. But otherwise, it's this future orientation. And I think that brings me back to the beginning, the crisis of the humanities. So insofar as one is just looking backward, I think then one also might bring oneself into a position where one is really not relevant to a contemporary debate, whereas insofar as one makes the past relevant to ideas about today and the future, then maybe one is. Is that the other big shift that you would see in all of this, that what we can learn, so to speak? We want to now learn what we have to learn from the Germans. So it's one of the things that we have to learn from the Germans, to think about the past in relationship to hopeful futures or desirable futures.
Yeah, although hope is often in short supply in this country, unfortunately. It's not it's hard to come by. And that is a mistake, by the way, that some Germans have made that I dearly hope Americans will avoid. When I first came to Berlin, the sort of people who were concerned with facing the Nazi past refused to read Goethe. And of course, people have taken down statues of Abraham Lincoln in certain places in the United States. We need to be able to deal with nuance in our history. And it's clear to me that certain monuments should come down, that certain glorifications of slavery need to come down. But we need to also to think about who in the past or perhaps in the present, though, I certainly don't think people should have statues as long as they're alive. There's something almost sacrilegious about that, it seems to me. But who in our histories represent the kind of values that we want our communities to share? I think the monuments debate in the States has been mistakenly focused on, you've heard the slogans, well, is it heritage or is it hate? And my argument is it's neither. It's about values, okay? It's about people who represent certain values. So, I think, let's see, am I answering your question, Niels?
Yeah. You're doing a great job. No, you just keep going. This is, we were talking about the future orientation of how we engage the past, but also I'm glad that you're bringing back the question of monuments, because that's also in a way where you started when you were talking about the 1980s, and a lot of that digging right here around had a lot to do with the the physical remnants of the past, that which was visible or invisible. And in that respect, it's, I guess, on some level, no different that some of the controversies erupted also quite literally around monuments and the things, so to speak, in our backyards that we found and didn't want. So very specific and very local, and not just abstractly as newspapers and the likes.
Absolutely. And I think it's very important that these efforts be as local as possible and as community-based as possible. It is about, I mean, I would say the German, so Neil MacGregor is a Scotsman who was head of the British Museum for a long time, but he's focused on German history. And he's a bit of a Germanophile. I like him quite a bit. I wonder sometimes if he's slightly more, even more laudatory of Germany than I'm sometimes inclined to be. But what he says is the British use their history to comfort themselves. And honestly, although he hasn't made a public statement about Brexit, I think if you look at the disaster of Brexit, it's a function of a completely mythological past in which there are an awful lot of Brits who are longing for empire. With 19%, according to a poll last year, only 19% of British citizens think there's anything at all to be apologized for in the question of empire. And if you know a little bit about British colonialism in India or in Kenya or various other places, you have to raise your eyebrows about that one. And Neil said the Germans use their history to think about the future. They certainly use their history to think about what they want to avoid in the future. And they've done a very good job of that. They're still working on, a lot of the details, and indeed more than details.
Thank you. Then I think we want to open it up a little bit. I have, I think, Christine Maxwell, right? You are on top of the list. You have a question in reference to the singularity of the Nazi crimes. You go. Do you unmute yourself, Christine?
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Right? Can all hear her? Yes, you could.
Okay. Hi. My question is this: you made this comment about a view of sort of looking at their past in a sort of singular. It was a singular Nazi. It was a singular moment of that sort of attitude. But it makes me think of both the singularity and the universality of the Holocaust itself. And I just wonder whether it's sort of backwards, but do you see, because there are universal lessons to be learned, it isn't it may have, that the word singular is quite problematic in that case. And I just wondered if you had a further comment.
I have lots of comments on that subject, actually. I think about a lot, and I just wrote a long piece for Die Zeit about it. Look, what do we mean when we use the words never again? I just started at the beginning. We cannot possibly mean never again should Germans put Jews in freight cars and take them to Poland to be gassed. Because as far as anything in history is predictable, that is not going to happen again. Okay, so to say never again and mean that singular event would be a tautology, be meaningless. Okay, what we mean when we say that is never again should anything similar happen.
Right.
And there's a quote that I use several times in the book from the Bulgarian French critic Tsvetan Todorov, who said, Germans should focus on the singularity of the Holocaust, and Jews should focus on its universality. Now, what does that mean? Okay, is that just relativism? No. My argument as a philosopher is, look, words are not just statements, they're also forms of action. When a German says, oh, the Holocaust is universal, everybody does it, that's starting to sound like the tropes of the Nazis. And I mean, Hitler pointed to the US genocide and theft of Native American lands and peoples to justify his own push to colonize Eastern Europe. Okay. And when Hitler was trying to say everybody does it, who remembers the Armenians? It's a way of avoiding responsibility. Okay. So when a German says the Holocaust is singular, she's taking responsibility. When a Jew says the Holocaust is singular and there was nothing else in history that was ever like it, I'm sorry, as a Jew, I feel like that's saying my pain is worse than everybody else's pain. Okay. And, you know, instead of saying, which I would like to do, this is a universal event with universal elements, I would like to use Jewish suffering as a bridge to other people's suffering, to do what I can to stand in solidarity with others. And so those are actions, they're not just words. And we tend to get lost in singular, universal, you know, and I think we need to focus on what people are actually doing when they insist on singularity.
Christine, I think you have a quick follow-up, you're saying?
I really appreciate that comment. I had a very quick comment. I'm sorry, but I can't help. I mean, you know, with my, I come from there, having lived there a long time. But one of the things that really, apart from what you have said, and I'm not disputing what you said, but one of the foundational reasons why the vote came out the way it did at the time was because there were so many businesses that were utterly fed up with the European Union's, you know, draconian, as they viewed it, controls of many things in Britain. So I just had to say that.
I don't want to reduce Brexit to one factor, but I think the nostalgia, both for empire and for Dunkirk, you know, I mean, that was what was so weird to hear people supporting Brexit saying, well, we did it before, we stood alone, and, you know, but you don't have to now. You know? It was, anyway, I think that less jingoistic history would have saved Great Britain, or maybe kept Great Britain great. We don't know what's going to happen with Scotland.
All right.
I'm very upset. Believe me.
I think, Christine,
Okay,
your sound
is
a little bit, breaks up a little bit. All right. There is still opportunity to follow up with more questions. Otherwise, I'll just jump in, just, you know, maybe with one other. Susan, sorry. I'm
checking in the chat. Oh, could I please repeat the line? Yeah, it's Germans should focus on singularity, the singularity of the Holocaust, and Jews should focus on its universality.
It's in the book. So if alone also for that quote, you want to, you know, have another look at it, and it's one of the you know, really striking kind of statements in there. You talked about Berlin in the 1980s being a divided city. You found it, you know, exciting. I remember it was also very grim and not particularly inviting in many ways, but be that as it may, Germany has changed in lots of ways, and so have the Germans. So I wonder, how much does the new quote unquote reality of Germany as being really today a far less homogenous and a far more diverse society than it would have been in the 1980s. How much is that something we need to kind of now take into consideration when we talk quote unquote about the Germans? That there are lots of divisions and differences internally, not just East, West, not just men, women, but obviously also a good many that have an immigration background and for whom this idea of the German past is something that comes to them probably in very different ways.
Well, as I'm sure you know, there are any number of debates taking place exactly around that subject in Germany now, and they're quite interesting. 20% of Germans now have at least one parent who came from a different country. And that's important. It's, I think, I probably would not have come back had Germany remained as Aryan as it was when I first got there in the 80s. But of course, there is the question, how are Turkish people, for example, supposed to feel about the crimes of the Nazis when they didn't commit them? I have a number of answers to that. And one is the answer that many Americans say, well, my people didn't own any slaves. They weren't even in America until after the end of the Civil War. So it has nothing to do with me. Well, frankly, most white people came to America after the Civil War. The great waves of immigration happened after the Civil War. So that's true of anybody. And yet, nevertheless, I think all of us, and my people didn't come until the beginning of the 20th century from Eastern Europe. But I nevertheless think that when you take citizenship in a country, you take certain benefits, and you also have to take a certain responsibility for its history. That is, history isn't racial. And it's a mistake to think of it as racial. I think we need to think of it in terms of citizenship. And there are very interesting things going on in Muslim communities regarding how to deal with the Nazi period and regarding how that's commemorated. It's somewhat different, but it's certainly not non-existent. And I know that there's some interesting sociological work being done on that right now, not finished in book form, but I know that it's happening. What else can I say? Perhaps it's important to point out again, because many people worry or would like to say the Muslim immigrants are bringing more anti-Semitism into the country. That's proven to be false. 96% of all the anti-Semitic incidents have been committed by right-wing, the word is bio-Germans. We can't use the word Aryan, but we say bio-German. I think the non-bio-German community is becoming more self-confident and louder. Many of them rightly complain that the lessons that Germans have learned from the Nazi period is to be nice to Jews, whatever being nice means. It's not always what I consider nice, but it doesn't include really a better attitude towards people of color. Now, again, people of color differ and split on that, just as Jews do. Every group splits. I know Americans of color who precisely came to Germany because they feel it's in general less racist than the United States, in the way that many African Americans came to Paris in both before and after the war. But so I've gotten lots of different reactions from Germans of color about how they experience racism. I would say it's definitely there, but people are working on it, and there's that's something that actually the Black Lives Matter demonstrations of last summer had a direct influence on Germany. There were demonstrations here, but in particular, people began talking much more straightforwardly about questions of racism. And it's a work in progress. And they still haven't really figured out how to deal with Jews yet in a way that Americans know how to deal with Jews. They certainly do everything they can to avoid overt expressions of anti-Semitism. But I've often in the last year or so been surprised to see very educated Germans be surprised at the information that Jews have differences of opinion, which if you know any Jewish jokes, will make you laugh because Jews have, there's a one famous, it's not even that funny, it's just so obvious, famous Jewish joke, you know, wherever there are two Jews, there are at least three different opinions. So, but it's a work in progress. But again, they took major steps from which Americans can and indeed are learning still.
Thank you. Let me just, there's one other comment in the chat that I just want to pick up on, and probably parallels a little bit my own experience, that as a German, you run into other Germans in the United States who've been here long, and they seem to sometimes have a particular version of what it means to be German that seems to be really frozen in time and can be at times really a bit disorienting. Would that be fair to say, Henry? Am I paraphrasing your bewildering account of the CD and the songs and the Dalla shop correctly, that there's another type of being German abroad that is sometimes so utterly removed from all the things that has happened in Germany ever since 45 that it's a little bit bewildering at times. But let me just, if you don't mind, just follow up a little bit one more, because I am interested in this question about the plurality. And I do follow now the conversations about the Humboldt Museum. And that seems to be its belated twin of sorts, that, you know, maybe the problem is that one has identified one single evil, so to speak, in the German past. And insofar as one is now willing to pluralize this and think about also how Germany in particular is a country like others that has a large collection of, you know, precious artifacts from other places. That's maybe one way of putting it. And who have not been particularly mindful of acknowledging that past, the colonial past of these objects, and that, you know, in almost clumsy ways, it seems to have come now forward with a, you know, newly opened Humboldt Museum. So is that maybe the way forward, that what we actually have to learn from the Germans, or from what we can see in Germany, is that the more the engagement with the Third Reich opens up a critical engagement with the entire past, the more it can, you know, actually become more inclusive of all of the Germans that these days live in Germany. Would you go along with that?
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I would say that, although there are people who would be angry for me for saying this, you know, the Germans are ahead of some of the other former colonial powers in dealing with this, precisely because they've had some practice in dealing with historical crimes. I mean, Belgium, you know, 10 million murdered people in Congo. They just began to think about taking down statues of King Leopold and, you know, dealing with that in some form or another. But they're absolutely in Spain. I mean, do we know anything about what the Spanish did in South America? And the Spanish have not really gotten around to dealing with their homegrown fascism. That's an issue that's still extremely controversial in Spain. And as far as I know, although I really should ask more about it, I don't know for sure, there's no movement in Spain to talk about its colonial past, which was horrendous. Okay, perhaps perhaps the most brutal. I don't know. So I know some Germans who work on the history of German colonialism who would be furious if I said that, because they would say I'm excusing them and so on and so on. But they're beginning the Humboldt Forum. For those who don't know this story, I think it's one of the funniest sort of cultural political stories I've ever heard. I'll try and tell it very briefly. There was an imperial palace in the center of Berlin that was partially bombed during the war, but that was completely blown up by the East German government, which decided it didn't want to have a symbol of imperialism in the most central place in town, understandably enough. The wall falls down. Oh, so they not only blew it up, they put instead something called the Palace of the Republic. The Palace of the Republic was the seat of the not terribly powerful East German parliament, but it was also a place that was very much beloved by ordinary East Germans who went there for concerts and birthday celebrations and so on. I've seen footage of Harry Belafonte singing from in the Place de la République, saying, "I bring you greetings from the other America." So it was a place that East Germans felt quite attached to. There was a problem, though. There were two problems. One is it was full of asbestos. The other problem was that it was hideously ugly, and it was in the center of town. So there was a movement to tear it down and build a replica of the former imperial palace. And it was very much an East-West battle, with many people, including progressives in the West, saying, what in the world do we need to spend, I don't know, almost $1 billion to rebuild the imperial palace for? And East Germans saying, you're destroying our heritage. And it went on, the argument went on for a good 10 years, and surprise, surprise, the West won, and they won with this rather interesting argument, as people kept saying, what in the world do we need a Disneyland palace for? And they said, well, we'll do something progressive. There are all these collections of non-European art at the edge of town. We will bring those collections into the palace, and so that they will be in dialogue with European art, sozusagen aufgewertet. For those who speak German, they will be
elevated a little bit.
Elevated, thank you. And that was accepted. The thing was built, but before it even opened, and it hasn't officially opened, of course, because of Corona, suddenly people realized almost all of those treasures were stolen, or bought under so much pressure that one has to compare it to stolen goods. So there is, of course, a huge debate. There are a number of people who've said they will never set foot in the Humboldt Forum because it's a bastion of colonialism. I find it very funny and a very interesting example of how quickly sometimes perceptions change. I know the director, I think he's a good guy. There's actually a project that I'm going to be working with him about, ways of actually talking about colonialism rather than simply being ashamed of it. Of course, they are giving some of the objects back. It's all work in progress, which is, of course, what makes it interesting to live here.
Very true. So I think we unfortunately gonna have to come to an end, but now you're hopefully not just enticed to read the book if you haven't done so, but once we can all again travel to Berlin. There's lots to see and lots to learn and lots of conflicting history, colonial, Third Reich, East Germany, any kind of variations of different uncomfortable pasts that you can kind of deal with and encounter, and also of the process of others having done that. Thank you again so much all for being here today. Thank you so much, Professor Neiman, Susan, for being here. This was our last lecture of the semester of a long academic year that hopefully will now come to its end. And then hopefully we will return in the fall with a little bit more face-to-face encounter. I think we've all enjoyed the beauties of Zoom, but also I think at this point our desire for doing other events again with food and with handshaking and those types of things have probably only increased. But I think this was a wonderful and very worthy way of completing our Zoom cycles of events. So thank you again all for being here, and thank you also for our wonderful guest again. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Pleasure to meet you too, and hope to see you in Berlin.
Same here. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.